Well, when invited to contribute to Alan's Festschrift, it seemed to me that something relating to 19th century Unitarianism would be appropriate, and that William Gaskell was Alan's sort of man, a man on a plethora of Unitarian committees. William, like Alan, has been described as the consummate committee man. But I do have one regret. When I looked at the proofs of the Transactions volume, it looked once again as if all Unitarians worth writing about are men. So please, will our historians try and write about all Unitarians and not just what is probably less than one half of them. Though, I must say, if you look carefully through the many pages of Alan's writings, you will find some women lurking there. So thank you, Alan, for that. So why did I choose William Gaskell, apart from this possible affinity with Alan? Well, as a member of Cross Street Chapel and a former principal of Unitarian College, Manchester, I'm in no doubt that the Reverend William Gaskell was a significant Unitarian. And yet, he's almost invisible in the histories of our movement. In his comparatively recent The Unitarians, A Short History, Len Smith mentions William Gaskell in connection with the founding of the Unitarian Home Missionary Board that we now know as Unitarian College, Manchester. But he identifies William as the husband of the novelist Elizabeth Gaskell. And is this the only time when a male minister is defined by his marriage to his wife, I wonder? I don't know of any other examples. William does not appear in either of William Wilbur's two-volume History of Unitarianism, or the English Presbyterians by Bolam and others, which are both still the standard references for anyone doing English Unitarian history. So in my short article, I set out to explore this apparent discrepancy, whereby a man so prominent in his day has been neglected by historians, and outside Manchester and our two colleges, largely forgotten, I suspect. And in my article, I suggest some reasons for this memory loss. But you'll need to read the article to discover the conclusions to which I came. So today, I just want to introduce you to the man of whom it was said at his death, "It would be difficult to consider our denominational interests without Mr. Gaskell at the head of them." I don't know whether anybody has said that of Alan, but William he came from a Warrington Unitarian family, was born in 1805. His father was a sailmaker, but I think a more successful sailmaker than Hammond was milliner, because Williams was marked out for a professional life. He graduated from Glasgow University when he was 20, and then went to Manchester College, which at that time was in York, to train for the ministry. Apparently, the college nearly rejected his application because he hasn't studied the required passage in Greek. He knew Greek, but he hadn't read the right bit. And it was only after a stroppy letter from his Uncle Holbrook that he was admitted. I've seen other letters from Uncle Holbrook, and he seemed to have been a really stroppy person. But anyway, he got William in. And it occurred to me that you might be able to help with a historical question that a colleague and I have been debating for the last few months. During the 1820s at York, one of the visitors who conducted the annual oral exams was the Reverend Lant Carpenter from Bristol. And he stayed with Catherine Capp, who was the widow of the former minister in St Saviour Gate. Now, on one particular occasion, the post arrived before breakfast, and contained a pamphlet, a sermon by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Lamb Carpenter was so struck by this sermon that he read it rather than eating his breakfast. So Catherine Capp's letter says that he scarce had time for both before he had to go off to do his duties at the college. Now, Andrew, I think, has been very careful not to write this down, but he once mentioned in passing that Lamb Carpenter let his toast go cold. And what we want to know is there any evidence for what Unitarian ministers ate for breakfast in the 1820s? And please let us have the answer later. It's amazing what we don't know about people's lives. Anyway, William survived his training at York and then went to be co-minister of Cross Street Chapel in Manchester. Again, it's rumoured that John Gooch Roberts, who was the senior minister there, had misgivings about William's appointment because of some misdemeanour that William had committed at York. John Gooch Roberts thought that William might not be quite serious, I think. However, as is often the case, someone who might have been thought unsuitable became a much-loved and successful minister. William never ministered anywhere else and died still in post as minister of Cross Street Chapel in 1884, aged 79. Though it has to be said that there were always two ministers, and by that stage his co-minister Alfred Steinthal was probably doing most of the work. I say that William was much loved. That's the general impression. But it's interesting to note that Gaskell gets very little space in the history of the chapel written by Sir Thomas Baker, who was a prominent member of the congregation. And it is rumoured that Baker didn't like him. Quite why, I don't know. But how important a person was William Gaskell? He did not take centre stage in the political life of Manchester because he thought that as a minister he should not get caught up in controversial politics. That was in contrast to a good number of his congregation, or at least the male members of his congregation. Because during Gaskell's ministry, Manchester gained both parliamentary representation and borough status. And Cross Street members, the men, were active in the Anti-Corn Law League and as councillors, mayors and members of Parliament. But Gaskell himself was content to work for such bodies as the Manchester and Salford Sanitary Association. At a time when cholera was rife, and as we've heard, things like typhus were around as well, pure drinking water and effective sewerage were not universal. Public health and the provision of water were absolutely vital issues. William gave many lectures to the society on matters of health and hygiene, lectures to ordinary people. He was also well known in the cultural life of the city, particularly in the education of young adults. The great Mosley Street schools were run jointly by the Cross Street and Mosley Street congregation. The Mosley Street congregation was the one that moved out to Upper Brook Street, not to be confused with Brook Street in Knutsford. This is Upper Brook Street in Manchester. The big schools there on the site of just behind where the Midland Hotel is now, if you know Manchester, provided day and evening classes in reading, writing and arithmetic, and Gaskell also gave evening lectures to working men on a variety of subjects. English literature was one of his specialisms. Indeed, he taught that at Manchester College when it moved back to Manchester. And he was very involved in the cultural life of Manchester, including being chairman of the Portico Library and Newsroom for 30 years. And if you want to know more about the importance of William in the cultural life of 19th century Manchester, I can recommend a little biography by Barbara Brill. But let's turn now to the Unitarian movement and William's role in that. He seems to have had a finger in almost every pie. Until the year of his death, he was still active in a remarkable number of Unitarian bodies. Apart from Manchester work with his congregation, the district Sunday schools, where he taught the teachers as well as the students, and the Manchester Domestic Mission, he'd also been the main fundraiser and a driving force behind the building of the Memorial Hall in the 1860s. On a wider scale, he was president of the Provincial Assembly of Presbyterian and Unitarian ministers and congregations of Lancashire and Cheshire from 1865 onwards. Nationally, he was vice president and member of the Council of the British and Foreign Unitarian Association, the BNFUA, which was the nearest thing that was going then to the General Assembly. And he was the only minister to have preached at its annual anniversary sermon on 3 occasions. I don't think nowadays we let anyone have more than 1 bite at the cherry, but he did 3. He was active in both institutions which prepared men for Unitarian ministry, being chairman of the committee and visitor for Manchester New College from 1853, when it moved to London, until his death, and former secretary, tutor and visitor at that college. He was tutor in English literature. And then once Manchester New College had, on its way from York, moved to London, sort of through Manchester, he was co-founder with John Relly Beard of the Unitarian Home Missionary Board, now known as Unitarian College, which he was a tutor there and became principal at the missionary board. He was also co-founder and a co-editor of the Unitarian Herald, which was a significant Unitarian weekly journal with a national readership from 1861 to 1875. And right up until the year of his death, he was in much demand as a preacher on special occasions, such as anniversaries and the openings of new buildings, and was particularly admired for his clarity combined with elegance of style. I think it would be difficult to think of anyone who was more prominent at that time in the Unitarian movement. I dare say that not even James Martineau was better known, though I might be taken to task on that later. I had wondered whether Gaskell had played a pivotal part in preventing the denomination from disintegrating when the different factions came to the fore in the annual meetings of the BNFUA in the 1860s, but that's another story, not for now. And after I'd spent some time going through the annual reports in Dr. Williams's library in London, I then went back to Manchester and read the reports in the Unitarian Herald and the Inquirer, which included lists of attenders. I found that William Gaskell hadn't actually been at those meetings. So that was something of a red herring. And it certainly doesn't answer the question about why William was so prominent in his day, but has not found a place in the Unitarian history books. But if you want to find out my ideas on that, you'll have to buy a copy of the Transactions.